So, as we move forward into the future and we find that our world has inevitably changed in light of everything that's happened in the last 2 years, it makes us try to think about what things we need to rethink in order to move forward. And one of the things that I have long thought needed some rethinking was our education system. Now, this isn't what you might typically think of someone when they say they want to reform education. It doesn't mean a top-down approach. Obviously, every locality is going to have different needs, and every locality is going to need a different solution, even if that solution is only slightly different than the one next door. This is actually something that I really advocate, is that each school district be permitted to figure out what their needs are and cater them the solutions for their zone to their needs, rather than trying to get a top-down approach that works for everyone. Because if No Child Left Behind is any indication, obviously top-down approaches just categorically don't work in practice, even if they look great on paper. And so, just as a case in point, the profession of teaching generally is facing shortages. In 2018, it was short 112,000 teachers nationwide. Now, considering the size of the American population, that doesn't seem like a lot, but it's still a lot of teachers, and that can definitely negatively impact entire states. On a per capita basis, that means that Vermont alone is short 224 teachers in a state with less than 650,000 population. On top of that, of course, the cost of college, which is necessary to become a teacher currently, is ballooning out of control, and I'm going to be addressing that as well. But before I do, I needed to kind of address something. So, Parler is now back online after a month after it got completely shut down by all of big tech for what was ostensibly allowing bad speech on it, but was more likely because they hated the competition. Frankly, I found Parler to be pretty milquetoast conservative. Well, milquetoast for conservative content. Obviously some people said bad things, but nothing worse than I've ever seen on Twitter. But they got a new logo, new CEO, new logo. I kind of chuckled because as soon as I saw this, there was a part of me that started to flash the light. So this is Parler's new logo. This variation is for their verified human being, right? That the person here is a real person. But what got me was, I'm like, that looks really familiar. And in the back of my head, where the weeb part of me lives. So for those of you who don't already know, I'm an anime otaku, especially when it comes to a particular type of series known as Gundam. For those of you who are not familiar, the Gundam series is a series about wars involving what they call mobile suits, which are giant robots. It was the original giant robot genre that made it popular. It may not be the original giant robot show, but it was the one that made it popular. Obviously, Robotech was also in there at about the same time. But there was a recent version of Gundam, a recent series of Gundam called Blooded Orphans, and the main character was a member of a group called Tekkadan. Tekkadan is basically means iron flower, and here was their logo. And I'm like, it's Tekkadan. They're not Tekkadan. But I would like to know what Parler would do if, a bunch of giant robots decided they were going to fall on them and sue them for stealing their logo. I don't honestly think it was a deliberate steal, but I did find it very hilarious, so I had to share that with you. But in the meantime, let's get back on topic. Now that I'm done giggling, education is critical to our youth in America and worldwide. The quality of education in the world today is by leaps and bounds better than it ever has been, generally speaking. Now, here in the United States, we have varying quality of education across the entire nation. That's going to happen because the United States, as I've said in my intro to U.S. government, the U.S. system, is not a unified nation. We're a federation, and therefore each state has different cultures, sometimes cultures within states, and they all have different values. But there are ways we can make education easier on our students, easier on our teachers, and better for everyone. And that's what I want to talk about tonight. We're navigating the cyberpunk dystopia. This is the Julien McBain Show. And the Julien McBain Show is brought to you today by the fact that I'm actually hunting during the day. As I'm sure you're aware, I don't have any sponsors. I do have patrons, and it is always brought to you by my patrons, whose patronage is greatly appreciated. Okay, so one of the biggest problems we have in education today are teachers. And I don't mean the teachers are bad. It's that we don't have enough of them, and they don't get enough support. Part of the problem is because of our antiquated method of budgeting things and our reliance on taxes in order to fund our schools. I have long said that taxes are a bad solution to funding government, and I've provided an alternative in another podcast, which I will put in the card up here. Obviously, I'm in the lower corner, but it'll be in the upper right-hand corner of the screen. The problem is that they aren't given the support they need. They aren't given the funding they need, because by its very nature, taxation is a poor way to fund anything, because it's dependent on the incomes and property of those who live in the area. If you're living in an area that doesn't have a lot of people, or where the jobs there are very difficult to come by or don't pay very much, you're going to naturally have a lower tax base. This is a problem that Vermont in particular is having today. Vermont doesn't have enough taxpayers, and we have some of the highest relative taxes in the nation. We have huge amounts of social welfare programs, which helps our citizens that are destitute, and there are definitely good arguments for having those programs. But we don't generate the tax dollars to pay for them because our taxes are high, and so people move away. Our education system's suffering from the same problem, and this is a problem that's going to keep growing nationwide as we continue to need more teachers, as our citizenry keeps getting larger, the population keeps getting larger. The holy grail of teaching, of course, and this isn't universal, but this seems to be what I understand to be the case, is being a post-secondary professor. It comes with a lot of benefits. One, being a professor pays a hell of a lot more than being a primary or secondary school teacher is, despite the fact that primary and secondary school are far more important than college. It's really counterintuitive. Part of that's because colleges are generally private, and even those public colleges that are out there rely more on their tuition rates than they do on taxes in order to operate. This is something that we could theoretically use in primary and secondary school, but unfortunately doesn't work very well when it comes to trying to get kids who are not productive and definitely don't want to have to take loans out in order to teach them, to get the basic of education they need in order to become productive citizens. This is one of those situations where you can't expect students who are still learning how to interact with each other socially and how to be people, like functioning adults as they grow up, to be able to pay their way. So we use tax dollars to invest in these students in order to make it so they can provide those tax dollars later. Inevitably, a lot of those students end up moving to other jurisdictions, which doesn't do the local jurisdiction that paid for that education much good. Now, you could argue that there might be solutions for that. Require the students to stay in an area for a certain length of time, encourage them to move back, find other ways. Obviously, none of these are going to work universally, and there's always problems to any solution that's come up with, even good ones. But it really becomes a problem when you get to post-secondary. So there are issues with primary and secondary education, especially when it comes to funding. But I think a lot of those can't be solved in the short term. They require a real digging into what the root problems are. And I'll be frank, I am not familiar with all of them, even though these are things I'm currently exploring. The two I'm most familiar with are post-secondary education and early childhood education. Now, full disclosure, my mother is an early childhood education teacher. She actually works with children in a county government organization. So these are all things that you should know. Washington County Mental Health is our county's mental health institution, and she works in childcare there. And therefore, a lot of my experience dealing with that, my knowledge comes from that relationship. On the post-secondary side, I have both one before I went to college and when I was in college and after I was out of college, especially during my ANCAP period when I was a very anarcho-capitalist, thinking that government is the absolute worst way to solve any problem. That hasn't changed too much, but I've become a lot more tempered in it. I watched tuition spiral out of control, and it's only gotten worse since 15 years ago. As an example, and this is really where it hurts people trying to become teachers. It's a circular firing squad, because our teachers need to have the education in order to teach. And then they end up getting a teaching job, especially in primary and secondary school, which relative to cost of living tends to pay shit. And I hate to say it like that, but there's no better way to say it. You know, nationwide, a bachelor's degree is going to cost around $36,000, which I think is really as BS as the term BS. Because I've yet to find most colleges, I don't know where they get the average from. All of the colleges around me are far more expensive. Vermont has some of the highest tuition rates in the nation from what I've been able to find. Now, it's definitely going to be affected by some colleges which have really low tuition rates. For instance, Tarrant County College in Texas has a per credit tuition rate for in-county residents of $50. So that definitely skews things and brings that average down. On the other hand, states like Vermont, where even our in-state tuition rates are out of control, will make it skew the other direction. For instance, Bennington College, which is I believe it's a private college in Bennington, Vermont, for resident students, including all tuition, fees, and dormitory room and board, will cost you $74,964 a year. That means that the average student is taking on some $280,000 in debt in order to graduate. And a lot of the programs they offer there are your types of liberal arts programs, or your there are hard sciences programs there, but there are a lot of liberal arts programs there that would be the standard Bachelor of Science for many teachers. That's a really expensive college to go to. That's more than I paid for college, and I went to a private college for flight. UVM, University of Vermont, which is our most well-known university. It's a research college. It's a hospital. I mean, UVM is one of the most diverse teaching environments available. And I like the model they have, but they still have issues. For instance, the tuition. The tuition alone for UVM for an in-state student, this means you live a resident of and grew up in Vermont, generally speaking, or you lived here for at least, I think it's a year for residency, is $18,802 per year. If you're from out of state, the tuition, these are just tuition, this does not include room and board, $43,690 per year for a 4-year college. So you're paying anywhere between $80,000 and $200,000 just for tuition. A teacher's going to pull in, what's the average salary for a teacher? Let me look this up. Average salary teacher in Vermont. And I'm going to use Vermont as my benchmark because this is where we're getting the information. So according to salary.com, it's $43,000 to $73,000 per year. According to ZipRecruiter, it's $18,000 to $47,000 per year. First off, that's a huge disparity between the two, and I know for a fact that ZipRecruiter is more accurate. And I know this because I know plenty of teachers. Some of my best friends have been or are teachers. My mother's a teacher. All of her friends are teachers, or many of her friends are teachers. No, none of them are making $73,000 a year. Those aren't the teachers. Those are the administrators. So if you think about it, let's even take the really generous in-state tuition amount, right, of $80,000. And let's say our teacher averages 20, okay? Now, that means it's going to take 4 full years of salary, with assuming you got every penny you earned, there were no taxes taken out of it, you didn't have anything you had to pay for, just every dollar you earned can go straight into your loans. It's 4 full years before it's paid off. Realistically, that doesn't happen. Realistically, if you can put 25% of your salary toward your student loans, that's a lot. So let's assume it's 10. 10% of $20,000 is $2,000. You divide that $80,000 by 2,000. Whoops. It's going to take 40 years to pay it off. And that's before interest. Now, obviously, they're going to end up paying more than that, probably between 2 and 3 times that. Then you have interest and all that wonderful jazz. I don't have a loan calculator set up, and unfortunately, all of my tools that I designed to do stuff like that back when I worked in personal finance, I've lost the files for. Yes, I actually programmed a set of financial tools when I was learning C#. It was actually kind of cool, but I don't have them anymore, which is unfortunate because I thought they were pretty functional. But basically what's happening is because of this, our teachers and students generally are graduating from college with crushing debt. They're graduating from college with crushing debt. And this is a problem. This is a problem especially because it disincentivizes people from taking jobs that, once you're off on your feet, if you didn't have debt, they'd easily be self-sustaining. Now, there are definitely positions people have taken that would theoretically solve the issue. A lot of people have suggested we make all public colleges tuition free and just take it out in taxes. Y'all know how I feel about taxes, though. So let's say that theoretically that would work. In practice, I think it would have as many problems as it solves. Another one is what we do now, where if a teacher works for 10 years, whatever's left of their loan, if they're making certain payments based on their salary, is automatically forgiven, which works in theory, but it basically turns teachers into serfs. That's basically debt indenture. Because if they quit teaching, they're still responsible for the full amount of the loan, and depending on the program you're on, they don't prorate it. So we've outlawed slavery, but we haven't. We call it by a different name. And then on top of that, with all of those crushing tuition rates and with everything that goes with it, if you end up in an economic downturn when you graduate, like when I graduated, or students that are graduating right now are going to deal with, where they can't get jobs, it could cripple them financially forever. Okay? And I need to make a disclosure here, because this is going to sound like a whole lot of self-interest. I currently am still paying down on what was originally $120,000 worth of student debt. I have an associate's degree. Part of the reason I didn't graduate is entirely my own fault. And so I do not fault the school system for doing that. That being said, the program I was in when the 2008 financial crash happened was for flight. Halfway through my time in college, the flight, a lot of your airlines, including small outfits, furloughed a large proportion of their pilots, which meant my job prospects went from really good to really poor almost overnight. And here I already had over $100,000 in debt to pay for flight fees because flying is expensive. A lot of students face this problem. They weren't in the same straits I was, and they didn't make the mistakes I made. But that doesn't mean that there aren't issues involved. And so I have disclosed this to you to let you know that I do have a perspective in this that is informed by my own experience. This doesn't mean I'm universally correct. However, sorry, houseflies are distracting. However, it does mean that I did experience this personally, so take whatever I say, of course, with a grain of salt. So let's start with teachers, and then we'll move into professions generally, because we've got to find a better way, okay? We can't keep relying on colleges for everything. Their costs are out of control because they know there's a bottleneck for students who are graduating from high school who want to get jobs that are beyond the entry level into growing into careers, to the fast track, basically speaking. Unfortunately, there's a fast track for a lot of jobs, theoretically speaking, because now a bachelor's degree is basically your high school diploma. Used to be you could come out of high school with a diploma, you could go get a job in a trade, become an apprentice, you could become a grocer, you could become any number of professions by learning on the job. Truckers, logistics, which is huge in America. We don't give people who work in logistics. Now we're talking warehouse workers, we're talking forklift operators, we're talking truck drivers, we're talking all of these people do not receive enough credit because we insist on people going to college. Okay? College is good for a few things. There are certain professions that really need to have college. Medicine. I don't want to hear that my doctor did not go to medical school. Law. Although I would say there is an argument for legal apprenticeship, which we have in Vermont. I think the barrier for entry for legal apprenticeship is a little high, but that's my opinion. Psychology is a type of medicine, so, therapy, things of that nature. Engineering, of course, because engineering. But beyond certain hard sciences, you don't necessarily need to have a degree. You just have to be competent. Often that competence is built from experience. And I'm going to say that teaching is part of that. Now, that does not mean that a person should be allowed to graduate from high school and jump into a teaching job with a license. That would make as much sense as trying to hand the keys to a tractor-trailer truck to someone who just got their driving license at the age of 16. It would not make sense to put them behind the wheel of that gigantic-ass truck, and it would not make the sense of handing a high school graduate the keys to a classroom to teach ninth graders. But we don't have to make it so onerous to where our teachers have to take on crushing debt in order to do so. So let's reintroduce apprenticeship programs. Teaching is a place where we have an opportunity for apprenticeship, especially in places like early childhood education, where care for the children and ability to socialize them is far more important than academics. And in fact, I dare say there are no academics in early childhood education relative to what we think of as academics. And they should be able to do this without tuition or licensure, or without having to pay tuition for classes in order to get licensed. I know a lot of early childhood education specialists who work in the field that are not licensed teachers because they don't have a bachelor's degree. Teachers with master's degrees walk into the child care center for the first time. They're brand new out of college. They've got their brand new sparkling master's degree, and they don't know what the hell they're doing. And the unlicensed teacher with 30 years of experience but no teaching license, because yes, they are often called teachers still, will run circles around them because they know what they're doing, because they're competent and they have experience. Now, there are people with experience that are utterly incompetent. That's going to happen. And there are very competent people who who graduate from college and know what they're doing, sometimes because they have a lot of siblings or cousins. But that is not universally the case, and more often than not is not the case. And so for these long-term teachers, if you've got 10 years working in industry, pretty sure you're qualified. I'm pretty sure we could determine alternative means for you to get that license, whether it's through testing or it's through observation, or there's some sort of rigor involved you might have to get signed off on. I am certain that there are ways that we can come up with in order to create an alternative means for certification. This lowers the barrier to entry to allow more teachers into the school system to relieve the teacher shortage, especially in early childhood education, where there is a huge gap. It reduces the dependency on debt and debt-based education, which means with fewer people having to go to college in order to get good jobs, the colleges are going to have to lower their tuition rates because they're going to have to compete. And this is where creating that market bottleneck where the colleges have pretty much cartelized education and the ability to get a job becomes a problem, because it creates a very anti-competitive nature of college. They're not competing with apprenticeship programs for students. They're not competing with trade jobs, because they can say, no, you're never going to get a job with any sort of real pay if you don't have a bachelor's degree, which is bullshit. I could have been an electrician. I would have paid $10,000 for my tools over time, apprenticing under an electrician and learning the trade. And there would have been classes involved, but the classes would have been paid for through the apprenticeship program. I might have taken on a little debt, or maybe I would have joined a trade union in order to trade labor for tuition to learn the trade. This is a legitimate means to making money, and electricians make something like $75,000 a year. Okay? And then from there, you can build a business, hire other electricians, and make even more money. Just saying. By forcing colleges to compete, they're going to have to look at their business models differently. Now, there are other ways to fix the problem with college costs, and I'm going to address two of them. One of them is going to sound a lot like my tax plan, because it just so happens that I looked at the way colleges can do things, and I thought, why can't government do it that way? The first thing is education generally needs to reduce administration costs. This is especially true in post-secondary education. I know that a lot of our public schools, the public high schools and in elementary schools, run on shoestring budgets. I am not bitching about their administration getting paid what they get paid, because compared to a lot of what colleges pay their professors and admin especially, it's bupkis. Okay? If I find out the principal of my high school is making $100,000, good for them. That does not bother me. I went to that high school. I know what BS that principal has to put up with. They earn that six-figure salary. Okay? And I'm willing to bet dollars to donuts they don't make that much. They probably make maybe 75. I would say we need to require colleges be transparent about whether or not they're a for-profit college. I don't have a huge problem with for-profit colleges for the most part. Like, I believe that you can run a for-profit college ethically. I do believe that they require more oversight because historically, for-profit colleges have had a lot of ethical problems. This is why ITT Technical Institute imploded. They had a lot of ethical problems and they had a lot of false advertising. I believe that's what it was. Fact check me on that one. I'm not trying to make a false statement of fact. My college was bought by ITT Tech. I thought it was a great idea at the time, and then the college died. And I believe that was the reason. They need to be transparent about endowments. Now, I'm going to use Harvard as an example because they're probably the most well-known school in education. It's the most well-known name in education. They're one of the oldest colleges in America. They were founded in 1636, before the United States was the United States. Massachusetts colony had had what would become Harvard University. And this is my case in point. This is why I think it can work for all colleges. This is why I think it can work to replace taxes. So Harvard University has an endowment. You might remember from my whole tax speech about endowments and how they can operate to fund just about anything. The endowment is worth $41.9 billion, according to Google. That is a lot of money. Not outrageous amounts of money, but it is certainly a lot of money. That endowment is likely processed through a trust, and because Harvard, I believe, is a nonprofit, they probably don't pay taxes on it. Under these circumstances, I don't have a problem with that. In fact, I would encourage that to be the case. Assuming the endowment has an average rate of return on investment of 5% per annum. That means that the endowment produces $2 billion, it's a little more than $2 billion per year in funds. That's $91,297 per student, considering Harvard has an average of 22,947 students per year. I believe that was last year's number. And I would say calling it 23,000 is probably a good round number. But based on that calculation, tuition at Harvard is $51,925 per student per year, which means the endowment produces almost twice what tuition is per student per year for Harvard. The endowment could easily pay for every student that runs through Harvard their full tuition. Now, I don't believe that includes room, board, and fees, but just even if they had to pay for their own room, board, and fees, that endowment could pay the entirety of their education. That's $200,000 in education. And the endowment would still produce almost a full amount to be able to put into whatever the endowment currently pays for. Now, as far as I know, the endowment mostly pays for research. That's not a bad thing. But was there a way that we could make it so the endowment consistently grows year over year? Might involve restricting the amount of dividends that come out of it every year. Oh, yeah, that was my solution to taxes. If you're going to charge tuition, which I honestly believe that there should be some skin in the game on the part of the student. Because if you just give a student free college, there's no incentive to go do anything, especially in an individualist society like the United States, like America has. They're just going to go there to hang. It's a networking event. In a lot of cases, college is just there to gain a network. Because they were in my fraternity, or they were in my sorority, or I went to class with that person. Especially in the Ivy League, that's pretty much what it's there for. And this was, lost my train of thought. But a college should be transparent about what the tuition goes into. How much goes into professor salaries per student? How much goes into administration cost? What is that administration cost paying for? What is paying for building taxes? What is paying for, not building taxes, but property taxes for the college? How much is a percentage that pays for the lights? What percentage pays for other infrastructure? What percentage is paid in overhead, right? Janitorial services. These are all very, very important. What pays so that the dean of the college can make $300,000 a year? Because that's part of it. How much bureaucracy does the college have that it doesn't necessarily need? Not only that, but colleges need to be a lot more transparent about things like job prospects. This is a major problem in a lot of colleges. They say, you won't get a job without having this degree. But realistically, what kind of a job can I expect? How many people graduated in 2008 with their bachelor's degree thinking they were going to jump into a $40,000 a year job to start and ended up at McDonald's? Now, don't get me wrong. I actually think McDonald's is a pretty decent job to have, especially when you're starting out. I've never worked for McDonald's, but from when I was in college, they actually said if you want to learn real business leadership, work for McDonald's for a couple of years, go into their management training program and go to Hamburger University. As of 15 years ago, it was the best business leadership education program in America. McDonald's. And I've looked at some of their business practices. They actually care about their employees. Even though people look down on the job, even though people look down on having to work there, and you work, that is a difficult job to have. I would say it's probably more difficult than being a grocer, and I was a grocer for a long time. I grew up in grocery. I remember having to clean shelves. Never forget your medication. It's a tough job to have, and you come home smelling like French fries. You know? But the people there, especially if you have a good franchise, especially if you work for a good franchise, they want to see their people grow. They reimburse tuition for their people to work for them. There's just a lot of benefits to working there, even though their salary is low. Now, that does not mean that everyone should quit their jobs and go work for McDonald's, but it means there's no shame in it. Just like there's no shame in working for a convenience store, working for a Walmart or Target. It's all dependent on what you want to do with your life. So that is not what I'm getting at with any of this. But they graduated from college with a bachelor's degree and found themselves in a job that had nothing to do with what they studied, and they ended up in jobs that they went to college to avoid. So what do we do to solve that? After the forced transparency, bring back trade schools, bring back apprenticeships, force colleges to compete again. That'll bring tuition down. That'll force them to rethink how they organize their schools. Or it'll force them to consider alternative means of funding, such as endowments, which will, by their very nature, eventually reduce tuition rates. There was one other thing that I really wanted to get into, and this is something that I actually explored in Ghosts of the Past, the book I wrote with my ex-wife that eventually I will get around to editing and putting out there somehow again. I'm sure that the first edition of it probably still has a couple of used copies on Amazon. Keeping in mind that it was written back when I was in college and I was an ANCAP, like straight up ANCAP. I still enjoy reading it, but maybe it's because I wrote it. Corporate tuition reimbursement is a great alternative, as is a corporate school. Hamburger University was we were told I went to school. After I cut out of the flight program, I changed majors into marketing management. And while I was in this marketing management class, it was an Excel program, which is kind of it's a bachelor's completion program where you can work full time. They said, if you want to learn business leadership, work for McDonald's and become a manager there. Work there for a couple of years. You'll really learn the best business management. And that made me think, corporate schools. You work for a company, they educate you, and you get an equivalency to like a bachelor's degree while you're working for them. They're paying you a salary. Your education's part of your job. And that certificate, that degree, whatever they want to call it, should have some sort of within industry recognition or even cross industry recognition. You know, if you get a degree at corporation, well, in the book, it was Corporate Naval Academy. And you go to Corporate Naval Academy because they were all learning how to become ship's crew, spaceships, because it's a sci-fi novel. And they learned how to be officers on the ship, and they graduated with bachelor's degrees, and they jumped on the ship. And if they went from the corporation to the Zaibatsu, which was the big competitor, the Zaibatsu recognized the corporate degree. You didn't have to go back to school because they knew there was a standard of education as part of that school. And they earned money while they do it, and they earned accolades. So just a couple of alternatives. I know this video is going a bit long, but there are ways we can rethink education. There are ways we can come up with better ways of doing things. We just have to think outside the box. And the only way we're going to do that is if we're willing to challenge the very notions that we have been drilled into our minds. It's just one step. One step of a lot. And hopefully, mobile suits don't rain down upon you. We're navigating the cyberpunk dystopia. This is the Julien McBain Show. The Julien McBain Show is a McBain Manor production. I'm your host, Julien McBain. My moderators for all live content are Kat J. Lambertson and Captain Aubrey. And a huge thank you to my patrons, Red Kryptonite, Jay Lambertson, and Spectrum 3600, without whose support this would be much more difficult. If you want to become a member of McBain Manor, please go to patreon.com/Julien McBain for only $5 a month. You get access to exclusive content, including my epilogue to my Fallout New Vegas live stream series, which will end up exploring all of the remainder of Fallout New Vegas that I can still access, along with special episodes of the Julien McBain Show and my 2 ebooks. As always, I want to thank you for joining us, and we will see you in the next one.